I woke up to the sound of thunder. It rattled the windows hard enough to wake the dead. The room was dark except for the faint blue glow of Mary's laptop. She had fallen asleep with it open again, something she did more and more these days. As I got up to close it, I noticed her USB flash drive was still plugged into the side. She must have forgotten to take it out before dozing off. I figured I'd eject it properly before shutting things down. She was always weird about that. But when I clicked the drive, a new folder caught my eye. It was named Sanctification_Video_Archive. My stomach turned. Curious, I opened it. There she was, my wife. Naked. Kneeling. And in front of her was that old bastard with grey hair and a ring on his finger, Pastor Michael. They were inside the church sanctuary. Right under the cross. She wasn't the only one. There were others. It was a recorded ritual, filmed on purpose. My breath caught. My jaw clenched. My hands turned ice cold. She didn't just cheat. She gave herself to a cult. To him. And this? This was how I found out. My name is Tom Harper. I'm 59. Almost 35 years of marriage. I've always been strong, straightforward. I was a firefighter for decades. Raised 3 kids. Built our house with my own hands. My wife, Mary, had always been there. Or so I thought. As we got older, she threw herself deeper into church life. First Sundays. Then midweek meetings. Then late-night prayer sessions. I didn't argue. I thought it was good for her soul. But things began to change. Locked phone. New clothes. Lingerie she never wore for me. And one day, I caught her wiring thousands of dollars to something called the Church of Eternal Cleansing. That name stuck in my head. I started digging. Quietly. I installed a GPS tracker on her car. Set up a discrete camera in the living room. Then I added monitoring software to her laptop. That's how I found it, the folder she thought was hidden. But this flash drive? It was different. She left it in by accident. And that mistake changed everything. It wasn't just sex. It was a full-blown ritual. Women in white robes. Chanting. Kneeling. Pastor Michael called it sanctifying the flesh vessel. Mary didn't flinch. She followed every word. I sat there, unable to move. All those nights she said she was praying. She was doing this. With him. In the so-called church. I didn't yell. Didn't wake her up. I planned. Coldly. Carefully. Because now, it was war. I copied the videos to another flash drive. I hid it in my garage workshop. Then I started reaching out. Message boards. Anonymous accounts. I found others. Women who had left. Women too scared to speak. They were ashamed. Ruined. And I knew, when they saw I wasn't afraid to take him on, they'd follow me. That night, I didn't sleep. The thunder kept rolling, but I barely heard it. I sat in my garage, sharpening a knife. Not for violence. For memory. For clarity. I used to save lives with these hands. Now, I'd use them to dismantle a lie. A sickness. Their church would fall. But I'd take it down one brick at a time. And she, Mary, she'd watch every piece of it crumble. Because this isn't just about betrayal. It's about justice. This is only the beginning. My revenge will be slow. Precise. Final. When I'm done, no one will remember me as her husband. They'll remember me as the man who burned down the temple. The morning after I found the video, everything felt colder. The coffee didn't taste right. The house sounded different. Even the ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder, more judgmental. Mary walked into the kitchen like nothing had happened. Hair tied up, robe on, humming some old church hymn as she poured herself a cup. I watched her, memorizing her every movement. She had no idea I knew. That I had seen everything. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. I needed to understand how deep it went. Later that day, while she was out, I took another look through the flash drive. There were over a dozen videos, all labeled with dates and titles like anointment ceremony, vessel renewal, and full submission. The faces of the women changed, but the setting stayed the same, inside the sanctuary of the Church of Eternal Cleansing. Pastor Michael was always there, directing every move with a twisted sense of authority. He wore white robes, always with that smug, soft smile, like he was above reproach. Like he believed he was God's hand. I created an alias. Simple name. Clean email. I joined their website. They had one. Disguised behind faith and community service, but if you knew where to look, you could find the path to the inner circle. I signed up for a local gathering in town. An open event meant to welcome new seekers. I wore a pressed shirt, jeans, and the tired expression of a man who'd lost his way. They welcomed me instantly. Smiles. Hugs. Handshakes. Too many handshakes. Too many knowing glances. The gathering was hosted at a community hall, decorated with white cloth, candles, and the same symbol I saw in the videos, a circle with a flame in the center. Pastor Michael arrived an hour in. I recognized him immediately. In person, he looked older. Thinner. But the aura was there. He didn't speak much at first. Just walked around, blessing people, laying hands on shoulders, muttering prayers. When he got to me, his hand rested just a little longer than necessary. His eyes studied mine. And then he smiled. "Welcome, brother," he said, his voice low and syrupy. "You look like someone ready for change." That night, I couldn't sleep again. I wrote down everything I saw. Every word spoken. I recreated the layout of the hall. Not just because I was gathering evidence, but because I was preparing. If this place was anything like their main church, I wanted to know how it functioned. Over the next 2 weeks, I kept attending. I asked questions. Played the part. I sat through lessons, prayer sessions, even one-on-one talks with elders. I learned their code words. Their expectations. And eventually, I got invited to something they called the Night of Spirit. It wasn't held in the main church. It was off-site. Remote. An old retreat center near the woods. Mary never mentioned this place, but I saw her name on the attendee list. That night, I followed them. Not officially. I told Mary the first was going on a short solo trip to clear my head. She believed me. Why wouldn't she? I packed gear, a small drone, camera lenses, a recorder. I arrived at the location 2 hours early and found a hiding spot in the woods. Cars started arriving at sunset. Quiet. No headlights. People walked silently toward the building. Everyone wore white. Hooded robes. I positioned the drone and watched from my phone. I saw them enter. I zoomed in. I saw her. Mary. Hood up. Head bowed. Following others like a disciple. And then I saw him. Pastor Michael. Arms wide. Speaking with that same voice I heard in the videos. I recorded everything. When they began chanting, I felt something click in my head. This was no church. This was a disease. A sickness hiding behind symbols and scripture. and I would be the cue. I didn't go home that night. I parked my truck on a gravel turnout a few miles from the retreat site and sat in the darkness. My fingers gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I played the footage back on my phone again and again. Every time I saw Mary in that robe, bowing her head to Pastor Michael, something inside me twisted tighter. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was the performance. The obedience. She wasn't brainwashed. She chose this. And he built it. Crafted it. Manipulated every weakness, every fear, every need. He took women who were lonely, aging, uncertain, and turned them into servants. Into vessels. That's what he called them. Vessels. I wasn't going to let it continue. By sunrise, I had a plan. Not just revenge. Exposure. Back in town, I began assembling my evidence. I made copies of everything, every video, photo, document. I stored them across several flash drives and cloud backups. I printed hard copies and stashed them in a fireproof safe. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I contacted 3 women from the online forums who had messaged me privately after my anonymous posts. Their stories were nearly identical. Recruited under the guise of spiritual guidance. Slowly isolated from family and friends. Pushed to contribute money, time, their bodies. Threatened subtly, if they left, they'd be forsaking their cleansing. If they talked, their souls would suffer. 2 of them cried as they told me. One of them didn't cry at all. She just stared into the camera, her voice flat as concrete. I asked each of them for permission to record our calls. They agreed. One of them sent me her own video. Her in the church, during a ceremony. The same symbols. The same chants. I compiled everything into a single presentation file. I created an anonymous email address and scheduled it to send to every major local news station, the state attorney's office, and several national outlets. I gave it a deadline, 5 days. That was how long I'd wait. In those 5 days, I moved like a ghost. At home, I acted normal. Polite. Cold. Mary seemed too wrapped up in her own world to notice the change. She spent more time texting, smiling to herself when she thought I wasn't looking. She cooked dinner like nothing had shifted. But everything had. On the 3rd day, I followed her again. She went to the main church building downtown. Not for a public service. It was midday, the place was locked to outsiders. But she had a key. I parked across the street and watched her disappear inside. I waited 10 minutes, then walked up the side alley. I knew from the blueprints I'd pulled off the city planning office that there was a second entrance, used only by staff. The keypad was old, barely held together. I cracked it in under 5 minutes with a little pressure and a wire shim. Once inside, I moved slow, keeping to the shadows. The place smelled like old wood, candle wax, and something faintly metallic. Voices echoed from the sanctuary. I crept closer. Mary was there. Along with Pastor Michael and 3 other women. They weren't praying. They were planning. He was assigning roles for another private ritual. He spoke with such calm authority, like this was routine. Mary laughed at something he said. A soft, girlish laugh I hadn't heard from her in years. I recorded every second from behind a pillar. Later that night, I replayed the clip over and over. There was no doubt anymore. She wasn't under a spell. She was part of the machine. Day 5 came. I cancelled the email. I wasn't going to let the news handle this. Not yet. They'd sanitize it, bury it under legalese and ongoing investigations. I needed to deliver justice. Myself. So I planned the finale. I bought a prepaid phone, untraceable. I used it to schedule a private counseling session with Pastor Michael. I told him I was ready, that I'd been touched by the Spirit. He set it for Friday evening, just after dark, at the church. I showed up early. I brought the drone again, set it on a rooftop, turned on the camera. I wore a body cam under my shirt and a recorder in my jacket pocket. Everything would be documented. He greeted me like a father welcoming home a prodigal son. That voice, syrupy sweet, full of fake concern. He led me into a side room with candles and cushions on the floor. Told me to sit. To open myself. I did. Then I confronted him. I told him who I was. What I'd seen. What I'd recorded. His face didn't change at first. But his eyes did. They went flat. Cold. Like a man realizing the gates of hell had opened. I told him I had enough to destroy him. That everything was ready. That I could send it with one click. He tried to talk his way out. You don't understand, brother. They come willingly. I give them peace. Healing. I stood. Got in his face. You gave my wife shame. You gave others trauma. And now I'm going to give you justice. Then I walked out. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. The final phase was ready. The storm was coming. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone sleep through it. I had him. On video. On audio. His words. His face. His twisted truth. I had enough to take him down legally, but I knew what would happen. Court dates. Lawyers. He'd play the victim. Claim persecution. Spin the story. He'd walk away with a slap on the wrist. Maybe even more followers. No. That wasn't enough. Not for what he'd done. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my workbench in the garage, surrounded by tools I hadn't used in years. My hands moved on their own, instinctively. Screws, wires, switches. I wasn't building a bomb, I'm not a monster. I was building justice. A device that would turn the truth into something no one could ignore. I rigged up a projection system, small, portable, but powerful. Something that could play video and audio directly onto the sanctuary wall. I loaded the most damning clips. I timed the playback. Synced it with the church's scheduled service for Sunday morning. Then I prepared the rest. I knew where the circuit breakers were. I knew their emergency lights. I knew the fire alarm system. Not because I planned to start one, but because I wanted people to panic just enough to pay attention. On Saturday, I played the role. I smiled at Mary. I even kissed her cheek. She looked surprised, but not suspicious. She told me she'd be gone early for Sunday's sunrise prayer. Said they were preparing something special. I nodded. That night, I moved like a shadow. I dressed in black, no logos. Gloves. Hat. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest. The side entrance wasn't locked. Not to me. Inside, the church was quiet. Dim. I moved quickly. I installed the projector high above the pulpit, hidden by the decorative arch, ran a cable to a hidden battery pack. Set the timer. Then I placed flash drives in each pew. One for every seat. Labeled, a truth. I didn't touch a single thing that could harm someone. No vandalism. No threats. Just exposure. Sunday morning came. Mary left before dawn. I waited. 10 minutes before the service began, I drove out of town. Parked at a lookout. Opened my laptop and logged into the drone feed. I watched the congregation file in. Pastor Michael took the stage, arms raised like a savior. Then the screen behind him lit up. At first, confusion. Then gasps. Screams. A woman fainted. Others stood frozen. The video played. Clear. Loud. Indisputable. Mary was in the front row. I saw her face. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She sat there, mouth open, hand over her heart, watching her world collapse. The video ran 10 minutes. Then silence. Then the fire alarm blared, exactly as planned. The congregation poured out. Police and news vans arrived soon after. Someone had already uploaded the footage. It spread like wildfire. By the time I got home that afternoon, Mary was gone. She left a note. Not an apology. Not a confession. Just 4 words: "You ruined everything." I laughed. Because no, Mary. You did. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a beer. I watched the sun go down, the last orange glow fading over the hills. My phone buzzed. Messages. Emails. Journalists. Victims. Thanking me. Begging me for more. Offering help. I turned the phone off. This wasn't about fame. Or praise. This was about ending a lie. That night, the church was set on fire. Not by me. I was home. I had proof. But someone who had seen enough, lit the match. The fire devoured it. They never rebuilt. Pastor Michael disappeared. Rumors say he fled the state. Others say worse. I don't care. He's gone. Mary moved in with her sister. We haven't spoken. I filed for divorce the next day. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far. Then I watch the videos again. And I know. Justice isn't always quiet. Sometimes, it burns. It had been 3 days since the fire. The town was still buzzing. Small towns don't forget scandals like that, not when they are public, viral, and involve half the local families. News vans were gone now, but their impact lingered. Pastor Michael's name was mud, and so was Mary's. People whispered her name at the grocery store, and no one brought casseroles anymore. I hadn't spoken to her. Didn't plan to. The divorce papers were filed, and as far as I was concerned, that chapter was closed. But the story wasn't over. Because even though the church was gone, the roots of that cult still crawled through the soil. And now, women who had been too scared to speak were finally coming forward. I spent hours answering emails. Dozens of them. Some were from reporters digging for more. I ignored those. Others were from victims, some from other towns, even other states, who recognized Pastor Michael. He wasn't a local man, it turned out. He had a history. Different names. Different churches. Always the same result. He'd move in, build trust, build control, then vanish when it all fell apart. He wasn't just a fraud. He was a serial manipulator. A predator with a pulpit. I decided it was time to go further. I contacted a friend from my old firefighting days, Sam. He'd retired early, gotten into private investigation. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I told him what I had, he drove in the next day. We sat in my garage, watching the raw footage. Sam didn't say much. Just took notes, rewound, replayed. When it ended, he looked at me with a face I hadn't seen since we pulled bodies out of a burning nursing home 20 years ago. "This is bigger than you think," he said. "He's not done. These types never stop." You took out the nest, but if he's alive, he's setting up another one. That lit something in me. Rage. Judy. I thought I was done. But I wasn't. Not until I knew he couldn't do it again. Sam made a few calls. Tracked his license plate to a rental car company. Found a lead. He was last seen in Tennessee, staying under the name Marcus Weller. Same MW initials. Clever. But not clever enough. We hit the road the next morning. 2 old men in a pickup, chasing justice across state lines. We drove through Mississippi, Alabama, into Tennessee. Took turns driving, eating gas station sandwiches and bad coffee. Finally, we found the place. A modest brick church in a small Tennessee town. Different name, New Dawn Fellowship. Same symbol on the door. A circle with a flame. We didn't go in. Not yet. We sat outside, watched. Sure enough, he was there. Pastor Michael, now calling himself Pastor Marcus. Same white robes. Same charm. Same hand on shoulders, whispers in ears. We recorded everything. And then we went to work. This time, I didn't need subterfuge. I had a plan. We visited the sheriff first. Showed him the footage. At first, he was skeptical, said he'd need a warrant, real proof. So we gave it to him. Flash drives. Testimonies. Names of women willing to testify. The sheriff's face changed when he watched. He turned pale. Then hard. He called in a deputy. Ordered surveillance. Promised to move fast. But I wasn't done. I called one of the local women who had emailed me. Her name was Teresa. She'd left Pastor Michael's first church in another state years ago. She still had nightmares. She agreed to drive up and tell her story to the sheriff. Brave woman. 3 days later, the raid happened. We weren't there for it. I didn't need to see him in cuffs. I just needed to know it was over. That night, Sam and I sat in a diner off the highway. He sipped his coffee, looked at me. "Think this finally did it?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah. I think so." He smirked. "Hell of a retirement, huh?" We laughed. The first real laugh in weeks. I went back home the next day. The house was quiet. Peaceful. No church hymns. No lies. Just silence. I stood on the porch that evening and watched the sky turn gold. I thought of Mary, of the past, of all I'd lost. And I thought of what I'd gained. Clarity. Justice. Peace. Some nights, the memories creep in. The laughter from the rituals. The hollow eyes of women who once believed. But then I remind myself, I did what needed to be done. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. Some end with fire. And sometimes, that's the only way to begin again. A month passed. People moved on. That's the thing about small towns, they gossip, they burn, but eventually, they forget. Or they pretend to. But I didn't. Couldn't. The fire may have burned the building down, but the ashes still lived inside me. I thought taking down Michael would bring peace. It did, for a while. But then came the silence. It's a strange thing, silence. After so much chaos, it's almost louder than noise. The mornings were still. My house too quiet. I started waking up at 4 a.m. again, just like in the firefighting days. Back then, I had a purpose. Now, I paced. I'd kept all the files. The backups. I told myself I held onto them in case someone needed proof, or if some reporter came knocking again. But the truth? I wasn't ready to let go. Then one day, I got a letter. Handwritten. No return address. It said, "You think it's over. It isn't. M." I read it 5 times. I didn't want to believe it. But the chill that ran through me said otherwise. I ran a full scan of my property. Cameras still intact. Nothing seemed touched. But someone had been close enough to leave that envelope on my porch without a trace. That meant one thing, as someone still loyal to Michael. Or Michael himself. I called Sam. He picked up on the second ring. "You heard from him?" he asked immediately. "I think so," I said. "Letter. I'll be there in the morning." When he arrived, we reviewed the footage from every camera. No one. Either they came in during a blackout, or they knew how to move. That narrowed the suspect pool. We started looking into Michael's past again. Dug deeper. More aliases came up. Old cases in Florida, Georgia. All sealed. Settled out of court. Victims silenced by payoffs or fear. But one name stood out, Eleanor Banks. She'd sued him years ago under another name. The case was dropped. But I found her. She was living under a new name in North Carolina. It took a favor from Sam's old PI network, but we reached her. She didn't want to talk at first. Said she had a family now. Said she was safe. But when I read her the letter, her voice cracked. "He never stops," she whispered. "He changes names, moves towns, starts over. He's addicted to the power. The control." I asked her if she wanted to stop him. Truly stop him. After a long pause, she said, "Yes." That started something new. We formed a coalition. Survivors. Allies. People who weren't going to let this die in silence. We built a digital archive, a site that looked like a support group but housed every document, every video, every testimony we had. We released it all anonymously. No ads. No donations. Just truth. It went viral. People from other countries reached out. Michael, or whoever he had been at the time, had touched lives across borders. He was more dangerous than we knew. One night, someone broke into my garage. They didn't steal anything. They left something. A burned Bible. Singed at the edges. Pages missing. Left open to a single verse, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." It wasn't subtle. But I didn't flinch. I moved the remaining files to off-site servers. Hired a private security team. I wasn't playing defense anymore. A week later, I got a message through the site's contact form. It was short. "You want closure? Come find me." Attached was a location, an old church in Louisiana. Abandoned for years. A trap? Maybe. But I couldn't ignore it. Sam tried to talk me out of it. Said we should send the police. But I knew the police wouldn't understand this fight. So I packed a bag. Gun. Recorder. Flashlight. And a flask of whiskey I hadn't touched in years. When I arrived, the place was dead silent. No lights. No sounds. Just the creaking of old wood and the rustle of wind through broken windows. I entered slowly. Gun drawn. In the front pew, someone sat waiting. "Hello, Tom," the voice said. And I knew. It was him. But he didn't look like the man I remembered. He was thinner. Older. Eyes wild, beard grown out. But the voice, that damn voice, was the same. "You think you won," he said. "You think burning a building ends faith?" I didn't burn a church, I said. I burned a lie. He laughed. Bitter. Hollow. You're not the first to try. You won't be the last. I raised the recorder. Confess, I said. He smiled. You already have everything. But here's the real truth, people want to be led. Even if it's off a cliff. I could have shot him. I didn't. I left. Outside, I sent the audio to the archive. It went live within minutes. And this time, no one could say it was fake. His voice. His words. His admission. Maybe it wouldn't stop others from rising. But this one, this name, this man, was finished. I looked back at the crumbling church one last time. Then I lit the flask and dropped it at the door. I didn't watch it burn. I walked away into the night, and this time, I didn't look back. I returned home with a weight lifted, and another one waiting. The man was finished. But the damage he'd done? It was still out there. I thought of the women, the families, the quiet victims who'd never get back what they lost. I couldn't forget them. A week passed. Then two. The site we built kept growing. Survivors from more states, even overseas, submitted their stories. Names, dates, rituals. It was like discovering a hidden graveyard, row after row of broken trust and faith. I worked from my garage, converting it into a command center. The world wasn't ready to look at these cults as predators, but we were going to make them. Mary hadn't contacted me. Not even once. I didn't expect her to. When the divorce finalized, she forfeited any claim to the house. That silence was the only thing I thanked her for. Then one day, a woman showed up at my door. Early 30s. Sharp eyes. Nervous fingers. She introduced herself as Rachel. Her voice trembled. I know who you are, she said. I was one of his. I need your help. We sat in the kitchen. She told me her story. She hadn't been part of the church, but one of the splinter groups, created by one of Michael's former disciples. Another man, another pastor, same playbook. He used Michael's old teachings, rituals, even the same chants. Claimed to be chosen to carry on the cleansing. I felt the fire rise in me again. This thing had grown roots. I called Sam. He drove in by nightfall. Rachel stayed the night in our spare room, the one Mary used to use. She barely slept. Neither did I. In the morning, we had a plan. Rachel still had access to the group's forums. We used her login to gather everything, names, events, locations. There was another retreat planned. Smaller scale. But just as dangerous. They called it the renewing. I couldn't let it happen. This time, we brought allies. 3 other survivors who were ready to fight. They met us near the woods outside the retreat location. We scoped the building. Another cabin-style lodge, isolated. Classic setup. Inside, they were already preparing. Candles. White cloth. Robes. Rachel volunteered to go in. She knew the language. The code words. We wired her with a MIC, just in case. Watching her walk through those doors made my stomach turn. But she didn't flinch. She was braver than most soldiers I'd known. Inside, she spoke to the new leader, some guy named Victor. Young. Arrogant. Called himself the flame bearer. I could hear his voice through the wire. Sweet. Soothing. Then sharp like a knife when someone questioned him. They were planning full ceremonies that night. Spiritual cleansing, they called it. The same phrase Michael used. I radioed the sheriff's department with our location. Asked them to come quietly. I had recordings, footage, names. It wasn't just about busting them. It was about proving the pattern. The raid came at midnight. We watched from the tree line as flashlights swept through the lodge. Screams. Confusion. Victor tried to run. Sam tackled him hard enough to knock the breath out of him. Rachel came out shaken but safe. That night, we drove her back to town. She cried in the truck. Said it was the first time she'd felt safe in years. Back home, I sat in the garage again. Same chair. Same desk. But now, the pictures on the wall were different. Faces. Stories. Survivors. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was war. And I wasn't alone. If Michael's legacy was going to be passed like a virus, I was going to be the cure. One camp. One town. One predator at a time. I didn't need fire this time. I had something stronger. The truth. And now, I was going to use it. The lodge raid didn't make the national news, but it didn't need to. In the right corners of the internet, it went viral. Forums lit up. Messages poured in. More survivors. More groups. We started mapping the spread like a disease chart. The same teachings, the same rituals, popping up under different names, the path of purity. The light within. Divine flame ministry. They all stemmed from Michael, or someone who learned from him. The virus wasn't just active, it was evolving. I wasn't a tech guy, but Sam brought in someone who was. A quiet kid named Jordan, ex-military intel, now living off-grid. He wore a hoodie that said "Trust no one" and had a laptop covered in stickers. But when he opened that thing, he made it sing. Jordan helped us build something new, a full-scale network. Encrypted. Anonymous. A safe space where survivors could share their stories, connect, and plan. We named it Ashes Rising. Within weeks, it grew to hundreds. Then thousands. Some came just to talk. Others? They wanted to fight. That's when I realized we needed structure. We weren't just a support group anymore. We were a movement. So I gave myself a new mission, I trained them. Every Saturday, I ran what we called Fire Watch. Not combat training, not exactly. But awareness. Survival. How to spot manipulation. How to document abuse without tipping anyone off. How to move without being seen. I taught them what the badge taught me. What the field taught me. What pain taught me. Mary still hadn't reached out. I learned through someone in town that she'd moved again, smaller city, quiet job, changed her last name. I should have felt nothing. But there was still a bitter ember in my chest whenever I heard her name. Then one night, as I was locking up, I heard a knock. I opened the door and froze. It was her. Mary stood there in jeans and a coat, hair longer than I remembered, eyes older. "Tom," she said. Voice quiet. I didn't answer. Just stepped aside. She walked in like she'd never left, but stopped when she saw the photos on the wall. The victims. The maps. The faces. She turned to me. "I didn't come to argue," she said. "Or ask for forgiveness. I came to help." I didn't move. "I've been in contact with some of them," she continued. "Women from back then. They still believe. They think Michael was the victim. But I know better now. I want to make it right." I didn't trust her. But I knew better than anyone what it felt like to carry guilt that heavy. "You don't get to undo what you did," I said. "But you can try to tip the scale." So we made a deal. She'd work remotely. No contact with leadership. No personal meetings. Just intel. She still knew people who were deep in the system. That made her valuable. For the next few months, she delivered notes, names, meeting times. We stopped 3 retreats. Prevented 2 more from forming. Rachel started leading survivor meetups. Sam traveled between towns with his own gear. Jordan secured everything. It became bigger than me. I thought this story would end with fire and revenge. But it didn't. It turned into something else. Not peace. Not exactly. But purpose. And sometimes, that's enough. The network kept growing. Ashes Rising had become more than a digital refuge. It was a living thing, breathing, evolving, carrying the voices of people who had been silenced for too long. Each new testimony was another nail in the coffin of this cultic plague. But with that growth came risk. We knew Michael was done. But others, like Victor, were still out there. Men who believed in the doctrine. Men who saw themselves as heirs to a twisted throne. And they were watching us. One evening, Rachel came into the garage, face pale, phone shaking in her hand. She'd received a message from one of the forums. Not a direct threat, but something worse, a photo. A picture of her house. Taken from outside her window. With one word beneath it. Soon. We doubled her security that night. Sam moved into her guest room with his gear. Jordan rerouted her online presence through a half-dozen proxies. But the message had landed. We were at war now. No longer in the shadows. I gathered the leadership team, Sam, Jordan, Rachel, and yes, even Mary. We met in person for the first time at a neutral cabin in the hills. Mary brought a map she'd hand-traced from conversations with old contacts. It showed 8 known splinter groups, still active. Some small, others more organized than we feared. They're preparing something, she said. They're calling it the Second Fire. Those words stuck in my head like a song I couldn't shake. We made a plan. Ashes Rising would go public. No more hidden site. No more anonymous releases. We'd put our names behind it. Videos. Stories. Faces. Let the world see who we were and what we'd survived. We released the first wave of content 3 weeks later. Survivor interviews, documentary footage, scanned court documents, leaked teachings. It hit like a shockwave. Some cheered. Others called it fake. But the movement exploded. Donations poured in, though we redirected most of it to shelters and therapy funds. But with exposure came backlash. Trolls. Threats. Lawsuits. One group, calling themselves Sons of Purity, posted a manifesto blaming us for attacking God's messengers. They promised retribution. Named me specifically. Called me a heretic. Said the fire I lit would come for me next. I didn't flinch. I posted a video response. Just me. Sitting in my garage. Looking straight into the camera. I'm not afraid of fire, I said. I've walked through it my whole life. And I'll walk through yours too, if I have to. That video hit 1 million views in 2 days. The threats got louder. But so did the support. And then, in the middle of all this, I got another letter. Same handwriting as before. No return address. It read, "You think you're saving them? You not." The fire never left. It just needed a new temple. Enclosed was a matchstick. Red-tipped. That night, our main server went down. A targeted attack. Jordan worked non-stop for 48 hours to rebuild. We lost some data. But not our momentum. We pushed harder. We took names public. We coordinated with law enforcement. Exposed 2 major groups in Texas and New Mexico. Arrests followed. Charges filed. A grand jury opened an inquiry into interstate cult activity. We were changing the narrative. Brick by brick. But in the quiet moments, I knew something else was coming. The second fire wasn't just a name. It was a promise. And I had a feeling they were going to try and make good on it. We knew they would strike. We just didn't know when, or where. That uncertainty was a blade at our backs. Everyone in Ashes Rising was on edge. We moved our core team to a secure site outside the city. The barn I'd converted was no longer enough. We needed something fortified. Rachel had started carrying. Sam was always armed. Mary rarely slept. And me? I barely ate. Then, on a Tuesday morning, it happened. A safe house in Colorado, a shelter we helped fund, was firebombed. No deaths. But 3 women were hospitalized. Survivors. One of them had testified against Victor. The message was clear. The second fire had begun. Local police stalled. Said they were investigating all possibilities. The feds were slow. Meanwhile, the Sons of Purity released another video online. Masked. Chanting. Reading scripture warped into poison. They claimed credit. Said the cleansing had begun. That they would bring down the heretics by flame and faith. We couldn't wait. We traced the upload. Jordan pulled strings. Found a location outside Flagstaff, an abandoned lodge. High elevation. Remote. He intercepted drone footage near the area. Dozens of people. Robes. Fires. Symbols carved into the dirt. A training ground. We assembled the team. 6 of us. Sam. Rachel. Jordan. Me. And 2 ex-military survivors who volunteered, Lena and Cruz. We weren't going to assault them. We weren't armed for war. We were going to expose them. Jordan equipped everyone with cameras. Bodycams. Audio recorders. Drones. Our goal was evidence. Names. Faces. Voices. Enough to force law enforcement's hand. We hiked in by nightfall. Moved slow. Stayed low. Set up drones from a nearby ridge. What we saw chilled us. Over 40 people. Bonfires. Sermons under the stars. They moved like soldiers. Chanted like zealots. And in the center, a man in red robes. Not Michael. Younger. Charismatic. Voice like velvet. His name was Ezra. He preached about finishing what Michael started. About fire being divine. About how Ashes Rising was the last beast to be slain before cleansing could spread. We recorded everything. Then we heard footsteps. They found one of the drones. Traced it. A chase through the woods followed. We split. Scrambled. Lena twisted her ankle. I helped carry her back to the Jeep while Jordan drove like hell down a dirt road lit only by moonlight. We got out. But not untouched. They took Rachel. Grabbed her during the chaos. We didn't notice until we regrouped back at the safe site. Her MIC had gone dark. I've never felt rage like that. They took one of us. So now I'm writing this as we prep. Sam's loading gear. Jordan's triangulating Rachel's last signal. We're going back. This time, not just to film. This time, to bring her home. And if that place burns? So be it. Because the second fire isn't theirs anymore. It's mine. We left before sunrise. The truck was silent, all of us thinking about Rachel. About what they could be doing to her. About how many hours we had left to stop it. The road to Flagstaff stretched out long and grey, early morning fog hiding the horizon. Sam drove like the road owed him answers. Jordan tracked Rachel's last signal. It hadn't moved. Same spot deep in the woods, near the lodge. Too far from any main road. They thought they were hidden. They weren't. We stopped 2 miles out. Packed light. Each of us wore dark clothes, radios, and bodycams. No one said it, but we were all carrying now. We hadn't come for war, but war had come to us. As we moved through the trees, we heard chanting. Low, rhythmic. Firelight flickered ahead. We ducked low, staying in the underbrush. Ezra stood before his crowd like a prophet possessed. Tonight, he boomed, we cleanse the traitor. We show the world that our flame still burns. They brought Rachel out. Tied. Gagged. Bruised. But alive. They set her on a wooden platform. Firewood stacked underneath. It wasn't just cult theatrics. It was an execution. I didn't wait. I stood up and walked into the clearing. Straight toward them. Sam cursed behind me. Jordan hissed for me to stop. But I didn't. 40 heads turned. Ezra pointed. There he is. The firestarter. The heretic. I stopped 20 feet from the pyre. Let her go, I said. He smiled. Or what? You'll burn us again? You already made your mark, Tom. Now we make ours. He snapped his fingers. 2 men stepped toward Rachel with torches. That's when everything exploded. Sam and Cruz came out of the trees, guns drawn. Jordan flew the drone in fast, floodlights blinding half the cult. Mary and Lena circled from the rear, cutting Rachel loose as chaos erupted. Someone fired a shot. Screams. Then fire. Real fire. Someone knocked over a lantern. The woods caught. I grabbed Rachel and ran. Behind us, people scattered. Some tried to fight. Others fled. Ezra stood still in the flames, arms wide, screaming scripture as the sky lit up orange. We got to the truck. Everyone made it. Bruised. Bloody. Breathing. Rachel sobbed in the backseat. Sam gripped the wheel with white knuckles. I looked back as the lodge collapsed. The second fire. Only this time, it wasn't theirs. It was ours. They tried to use fire as fear. We turned it into justice. Weeks passed. The footage went public. Arrests followed. The Sons of Purity fractured. Their leaders vanished or were taken down one by one. Ashes Rising became more than a movement. It became a firewall, one that would burn every lie these cults built their temples on. Rachel healed. She started speaking publicly. Sam went back to private investigation. Jordan built networks for other survivor groups. Mary? She never asked for forgiveness. But she never left the fight. And me? I rebuilt my garage. Hung a sign on the wall that said, Truth. Fire. Justice. Sometimes I still wake from dreams of chanting. Of fire. But when I do, I open my eyes and remember. We didn't just stop a cult. We started a war against silence. And we won.